Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business, Innovation, and Managing Life. So we have a bunch of questions that I see have come in here. Let me take a look. Let's see what we should cover first. Oh, there's a question, a comment from Con Polly commenting that I seem to know and remember so much. Thanks. Any hints on memory techniques and how to learn in general, especially math, physics as an adult? First point is, I don't think I've ever actively made an effort to, in adult life at least, to actively made an effort to memorize things explicitly. Actually, I remember one incident. I remember one time I was years ago. I moved to a new state and I was getting a driver's license, and you had to go and do some test. And I did take the driver's book, and I kind of read it, and I read it a couple of times, and it's like. And I did make some effort to memorize that. I go in and take this, DMV test, and I get all the questions right. And the person looks at me very strangely and says, basically, nobody ever gets all these questions right. So I guess that's what the combination of making an effort to memorize something and having a decent memory to begin with perhaps gets you, and not very useful in that particular case. But more seriously, the main way that I ever learn things is by using them and having a reason to learn them. And I think that oops, sorry, just a second. Yes, the thing that if you ask me about pretty much any random fact, there's a decent chance that I'll remember where I learned that fact, and it will be a huge range of different places. I usually will not remember. I might be with effort, I might be able to bracket which decade I learned the fact in, but I usually wouldn't remember when I learned it. But I would typically remember kind of what what caused me to learn it, and maybe from that I could work out when. But I mean, I think that when I've tried to learn things just cold, like pick up a textbook, try and read through and learn it, I cannot remember that stuff. What makes me able to remember things is when I'm trying to figure something out and I have kind of a hypothesis for how things work. And then I go read the textbook or whatever and see how what the textbook says fits into the hypothesis that I'd already developed. Then I can remember it. I think that sort of, at least for me, sort of using things and sort of caring about those things because they showed up in something that I'm trying to figure out is what causes me to remember things. I have to say, I was recently noticing that all sorts of random stuff that I learned when I was a kid, like Latin and Greek irregular verbs and so on, I realized that I do still remember that stuff, which I find sort of surprising because I was not that excited about it when I learned it. But I guess I learned it well enough that it stuck. But in general, in sort of adult times, it's learning by doing. Now, I would say in terms of things like math and physics and so on, there are, I would say, things where one is not ready to learn something yet. There's some very abstract formalism, and you could kind of go in cold and try and learn that thing abstractly. At least for me, that's really difficult. Once I know lots of examples that kind of make it sort of, when I finally see the abstraction, I say, aha, now all those examples fit together, then I can understand the abstraction. But when it's just kind of, let me just learn the abstraction cold without knowing why I should care, I find that difficult. And I think other people find it difficult too. I think that I always find it kind of interesting from times past, even, explaining Wolfram language to people, particularly younger folk, kids and so on. And most people kind of learn from examples. It works this way, then it works this way, then it works that way, and you kind of build up some cognitive map of how it works. Occasionally, some kid will just say, no, just tell me the principle of how it works. And sometimes those kids are, they're right. That's how they best learn it. You say it's constructed this way, it's made of a this and a that and the other, and it's a very abstract statement of what's going on. And usually my comment to those kids is, when you're grown up, you'll be a pure mathematician or something analogous to that. And I think that's turned out to be the case in at least a few examples that I know. So it's a particular way of thinking about things, sort of abstraction first, that is not the most common for people. It's not the most common for me, for example. Sometimes I found that I try and learn things that are sort of the abstract level, and I really just don't get it. And once I've seen concrete examples, a bunch of concrete examples, then when I look at the abstraction again, it's kind of the aha moment. What I've also noticed is that when I try to learn about a field, I was just learning about the history of thermodynamics. That's the particular topic my last couple of weeks I've been studying, because I kind of it's actually a question I've been chasing for 50 years, no less. I first got exposed myself to it when I was like 12 years old, and got very interested in this thing, the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy increase and so on, and why it's true and how often, when it's true and so on. And I think I'm in a position to really nail the answer to that question. And it's turning out to be quite surprising to me what the answer is. But in trying to nail the answer to that question, one of the things might be of interest to say is, I'm coming up with some conclusions which are kind of different from what people would typically say and what typically the textbooks say. And I'm like, am I right? Well, one thing that's sort of amusing in this particular case is you go and look at textbooks, and the good textbooks basically say there is a mystery here. It's not completely clear how things work. The not so good textbooks just sort of say, oh yeah, it was established 100 years ago. But I was then curious, given that I'm sort of looking at things where I kind of think something kind of went a little bit astray a long time ago. I was back to the 1860s and kind of trying to explore what actually happened. And at first I was finding it super confusing, because I thought I knew this history and it didn't really fit together. And, as is very typical with these kinds of things, you read a bunch of stuff, you look at more things. And for me, I have to sort of develop a hypothesis about what happened. I think my first hypothesis wasn't quite right. Then I finally get one, and now I can go check that hypothesis by reading different original works, and then it now all fits together. So but I often find it to be the case that when you first dive into a fairly complicated area, it's like you feel like you're drowning, because there are all these different things, and there are all these different, you look at the next document, and it's very, it's very different from what you've seen before, and how does that fit in with anything else? And there's a great tendency to say, oh my gosh, I'm just going to drown in this field, I'm not going to be able to figure it out. I tend to persist, because I have the confidence that I will actually be able to figure it out, and at some moment it'll start fitting together. And then for me, it's very quick usually. After I've gone through the deepest drowning stage, and I'm coming out of that, usually one sort of jumps out pretty quickly, and then it really all fits together, and one kind of knows what's going on. Let's see. Oh, wow. Thomas had asked here, what do you think of shifts in perspective as a source of discoveries in science? Is there any place for discoveries based on questioning the status quo? Amusing that you should ask that, given that I was just describing my experience in looking at the second law of thermodynamics, which I have to say, I had long thought various things were true about it. And turns out they're probably not. And other people have thought they were true also for like 150 years. So this is a case where I'm definitely in the questioning the status quo. I think that, it's complicated. There are things where people will say, oh, okay. So here's, I think, the point. If you're going to question the status quo, for example, in science, you kind of have got to do your homework. It's no good just saying, I don't believe X, because you don't understand X. If you really do understand X, and then you say, well, I don't think that's quite right, and you've got something else, that can be very interesting. Now, in one of the traps here is some things, to understand them well, take so long that by the time you have immersed yourself in that field for that long, you'll never be able to break out of the status quo. I myself have been kind of lucky in this regard because I've worked on a bunch of things spaced out often by many years. So, for example, this thing that I'm doing about thermodynamics, I first looked at this 50 years ago. And I've looked at it again. I looked at it again in the 1990s. I made quite a bit of progress then. I haven't really looked at it since. And so, in a sense, I'm much less invested in the sort of, even though I had immersed myself pretty deeply in how this all works back whenever, I don't feel like it's kind of I don't feel perhaps the emotional pressure that, oh, it all has to be true because I'm so involved in the thing now, because when I was involved in it and learnt it was decades ago. So that's been sort of a fortunate situation of being able to, quote, question the status quo. I mean, one thing that's happened in our physics project, for example, is that there are many aspects of kind of the way that physics has been believed to work for the last 100 years that we've had to kind of change direction on. Now, the thing that makes me fairly confident about that is I really do understand what the sort of what the status quo is for physics and how that all works. I have to say I was extremely amused because one of the things that about something I was studying in the history of thermodynamics, one of the things that's sort of a big departure in our model of physics is the idea that space is not continuous, but is made of discrete sort of atoms of space. And what we perceive at the level that we are operating at, the size scale we're operating at, is just the effect of a very, very large number of atoms of space that seem to us continuous. And I've often used the analogy, it's a little bit like what happens with a fluid like water. Water seems to sort of pour and flow continuously, yet underneath we know it's made of molecules, atoms, and so on. Well, I hadn't realized that back in the 1860s and 1870s, there was a big discussion about whether fluids like water were made of atoms, whether atoms were real, all this kind of thing. People had guessed that gases might be made of atoms bouncing around back in the 1600s, but that theory had kind of fallen out of favor. Well, now we go to the 1870s, and people are having all these arguments about, no, fluids like water couldn't possibly be made of discrete things. Look, we can tell that they're continuous. You pour it and it flows, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm just kind of amused because the kinds of arguments and the kinds of thoughts people might have today about, no, space is continuous, it's not made of discrete things, are exactly the same as the arguments that people had in like the 1870s about how material objects were not made of discrete atoms. So it's kind of interesting that people don't sort of learn from that history that you shouldn't make those assumptions. But that's a case where back then, people fought very hard. Some people fought very hard for kind of the atomic point of view, and eventually sort of it became clear that that really was how things worked. At the beginning, people were sort of just saying, it's just some kind of mathematical idealization that we're going to use or something like that, rather than considering it real. Let's see. Oh my, Parker is asking, of the smartest people you've had a chance to communicate with, who stands out the most? Why do they stand out? I don't know. I've had the good fortune to know a lot of very smart people, and I don't think there's a scale, a sort of smartometer scale, so to speak. I mean, there are people who are really good at figuring out, I don't know, some situation in the world with the intuition and so on necessary to work that out. And there are other people who are really good at, making some complicated program work, or are really good at figuring out some science problem, those kinds of things. And, I think one of the things I've learned from running a company for a long time is in a company, you've got many different projects that have to be done. You've got lots of different people. And it's not the case that you just say, that's a good person, so we'll put them on any project. It's like there's a matching between projects and people that has to happen. And the same is true with kind of the smart people, however that's defined. I mean, I mentioned two people who I knew who are kind of slightly interesting sort of historical figures. Partly mentioned them because of a certain similarity. One is Richard Feynman, Dick Feynman, who was a physicist who died in probably 1987, 1988, who I knew was considerably older than me. I knew when I was kind of in my 18 to early 20s, and he was 60 in his 60s. Another person I mentioned is Steve Jobs, who I knew for probably the last decade or two of his life. I mention those two because they had a great similarity. I mean, in outward characteristics are very different. Dick Feynman was a physicist who was also interested in kind of explaining things, sort of understanding how things work. Steve Jobs was an entrepreneur, interested in building products and things like that. But the great similarity those two had was they were both interested in kind of what is the essence of what's going on in a thing. And so for Dick Feynman, it's kind of like, here's this phenomenon in physics, and what's really going on? How do we simplify? How do we turn this into something? In the case of Dick Feynman, it was something that we can both understand at a research level and explain it as an expository kind of way. But how do we kind of drill down and get to the sort of primitives, the essence of what's going on underneath? And Steve Jobs was really the same thing. But in that case, it was about products. What is the kind of minimal thing that you need to have to make a touch-based, smartphone type thing? And I always found it interesting that even though the outward manifestations were so very different, both of those two shared the feature that they were really interested in getting down to the sort of primitive essence of things. And then I would say in both cases, somewhat kind of building up to, from understanding that sort of primitive essence, building up to then, well, what does that mean, in terms of some mathematical calculation? What does that mean in terms of some actual engineering or product or whatever? And I suppose I found those two interesting, partly because I think my own skills, such as they are mostly in the direction of taking sort of complicated collections of things and trying to drill down to figure out what the essence is, and then building back up from there. So perhaps I have some resonance with those kinds of things. Let's see. Let's see. Atoria asks, how do you spend money in a wise way? Do I have heuristics? I always have the theory that I spend no money, but it isn't really true. I would say that the first, there are things that I might not spend money on. Like I might say, oh, I can get by without the fancier computer, without, staying at the better hotel, without, having somebody help me with this or that thing. I can get by without these things. But one of the things I learned years ago is often it's just spend the money, because you have to kind of balance. You could say, well, look, I don't really need to stay at the nicer hotel. I don't really need to go first class on whatever thing. I can get by with the other with not doing those things. But it turns out it has a cost, and you have to kind of work out what really is that cost to you. The cost might be, oh, I travel in a lower budget way, and that means that I'm totally spaced out, really tired in some situation where I don't really get the benefit of the thing that I traveled all that distance to be able to do, or whatever else it is. And so, you think you're saving money, but you're actually just sort of blowing up the thing that you tried to set up to begin with. And similarly, in some of these things, like, is it better to do something yourself or to pay somebody else to do it? Sometimes it's one of these things, well, yes, of course I could do it, but you have to sort of balance, well, is it actually a better idea for me to spend that time doing this or that? I think one of the things that for me personally, sometimes there are cases where spending money to get certainty or to get something closer to certainty is worthwhile. Like you could do something where you do it the budget way, or you do it the way where you kind of know how it's going to work, but it costs more. And for me, kind of the additional sort of stress of, oh, is it going to work? I don't get that stressed, but I think, is it going to work? Am I going to be able to, catch the train or whatever else it is? Or, am I going to be, running from here to there? Or, or do I just like, okay, I know it's going to be fine. I'm just going to, get out my computer and start doing my work, and I'll just, not have to worry about anything. There's a value to that to me. And, it's worthwhile to know sort of what that value is. Now, there are other places where I would say one of the places one ends up, there are things where you spend money and do you pay attention to how you're spending that money? A very common thing bites me from time to time is you set something up and you're like spending money on this, and it's a thing that you spend money on every month or whatever else. And for a long time, it's kind of like, yeah, it's it makes sense, it's worthwhile. But then somehow you don't really notice that it's starting to be more expensive, or it's starting to be less useful or whatever else. And you don't know you don't just cut it off, or you don't go and push back on it. And I think one of the things that tends to happen is, to not spend money takes effort. Particularly when you have some repeating thing, you have to actually decide, I'm going to go in and I'm going to investigate what's going on, and I'm going to decide, should I keep spending this money? And, I've certainly found for myself, one of the things that's always useful is getting, when I get sort of the data about what I'm spending money on, and I do this also for our company, it's kind of all the trailing 12-month expenses, the year-to-date expenses, and so on, rather than just like, well, what do I owe this month? Because, particularly if you can have, as is common in accounting and so on, you can see, past year as well as the current year. And I particularly like trailing 12-month data rather than just year-to-date data, because year-to-date data, it's like it's February and there's still a lot of fluctuation in the expense on something in that year because there just haven't been much time in the year. Whereas trailing 12 months, you get to see since last February, and then you compare it to previous, years, February to February, so to speak. And I often find that useful. And for me, that's a good sort of checkpoint. But it is a very typical thing that, sometimes, actually, I noticed this with the company too. You have a project and you put a lot of effort into it. People working on it, it's a lot of intensity. You spend a bunch of money getting that project to the point where it's launched. And then the project, really, there's a lot less to do. It's kind of just running, and it still needs people. People still have to pay attention to it, but it's a lot less effort. But the killer is you end up spending more money in that second phase than in the first phase. I've seen this happen a bunch of times. And that's caused me to have the sort of the knee-jerk reaction. When a project is finished and launched, okay, what's the next thing to think about? It's how do I take the resources that were spent on that project and reallocate them to other things? Because I know that the intensity of resources that was spent in launching that project will not be necessary after the project is launched. But there is a great tendency for those same resources to just keep kind of running, particularly if the project is successful. People are like, oh, this is great. And let me keep working on it, keep polishing it, and so on. It's not to say it shouldn't be polished, but you can absolutely throttle back those resources, but it takes active effort to do that. So I think that's this. But one of the places where in my experience, money gets wasted is in the tails of things. After it's been running for a while, you were paying attention, you really were managing it tightly, and then it kind of, it's kind of worked, or you've just been doing it that way for years type thing. That's the time when things go wrong. Now, it's also a question of how much effort do you put in to going and chasing those things. You can go and worry about things all the time, or you can wait. And sometimes the company, for example, I do the calculation that this thing, well, it's not perfect, but it's probably not going too far in the wrong direction. I'm just going to leave it for a few years. And in a few years, I'll know, is it relevant? Is it important? Is it not important? Did it just get totally messed up? And now we really have to come and pull hard to get it cleaned up again. It's often easier to do that, to wait for the thing to degrade and then pull it very hard, than it is to be like continuously trying to do mid-course corrections. I mean, I would say that there are cases where the mid-course corrections on projects, for example, on things that are running, processes that are running, can actually be make them worse. So a typical example, one that I was exposed to recently, it's about books. And, I wrote this book, Elementary Introduction to Wolfram Language. and we're just working on the third edition of it. And so I was making a bunch of changes. Okay, when you go in to do that, the thing that I'm always very worried about is I'll see something on some page and I'll say, I need to change that. But I'm a little bit too lazy to go and read the whole chapter and see how it fits into the rest of the chapter. And I say, I got to make that change. And then I realize, oh my gosh, a page later, I had already said that before. I didn't need to make that change. I just was pacing things differently and it's all good. But it's so easy to just say, you go in and you say, I can tweak something, I can make it a little better. And actually the making it locally better is making it globally worse. I mean, the most extreme example of this is sort of a cautionary tale, happened in the Mathematica book, which first came out in 1988 when what's now Wolfram Language first launched as Mathematica. And I wrote this book, which was like 600 pages long. And people really liked this book. And it was, it was a kind of you could read it from beginning to end. And it was a nice sort of systematic treatment of what Mathematica was about and so on. Well, in subsequent versions, by version 2, I added some things to it. And then came version 3. And then version 3 was a big, larger version of the product and so on. And it was like, okay, I have to add a lot of stuff to the book. So the book went from being 600 pages to being like 1,000 pages, I think, or maybe even 1,200 pages at that time. Big, and the book went from being quite thin to quite thick. And then by version 5, I think the book was like 1,600 pages or something. And the problem was the book was unreadable. It had gone from a thing that was a nice kind of, a linear read to something where it had all these pieces that had been added to it. And it made the thing not really a linear read. And it made it a quite unwieldy object. And I've seen the same thing happen with projects when they sort of have mid-course corrections. And sometimes it's better to let the thing kind of degrade for 5 years and then say, oh, now we have to, revise it completely. I would say the same thing happens, for example, with the code bases for our products. I mean, we've been lucky enough that, we've done a good job on building code, and there's a lot of code that's 25, 30 years old and is absolutely 100% fine. I'm a little bit scared sometimes when I discover that a bunch of core code in the core language of Wolfram Language was code that I wrote in like 1987 and so on. And it's still, running billions of times every day type thing. But, it's been sort of well tested and well explored, and it seems to be right. And so whatever. But one of the things we find is that given a particular area of, let's say, algorithmic computation, it's like we do a really good job at a certain time based on the raw material that we have at that time. And that raw material is other capabilities in the language, algorithms that people have invented out in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, that runs just fine for years, decades, perhaps. But then there comes a time when we say, okay, this area, it's been 25 years, we're going to revise this area because there's enough new stuff that it really makes sense to do that revision. Had we been trying to do the revision incrementally, it would have been a mess. But 25 years later, we say, okay, what were all the suggestions people made in those 25 years? What's all the new stuff that's happened in 25 years? Let's go in and make a major revision. That's a much more sensible way to do things than it is to kind of make those incremental revisions, which are more like a random walk, where some things get better, some things get worse. So I think that's been a sort of typical way to do that. And I think that's, anyway, that's a practice that I've tended to follow. Let's see. Question here from John. What technology would you keep away from your children and for how long? Well, my 4 kids are all, almost all sort of full adults, so to speak, at this point. So I don't think, gosh, I don't think I'm in a position to keep much technology away from them, and I never have. I think that, I think everybody's kids are different, but I think there are things where, I certainly, to some extent, I lament seeing kids where it's like, it's just video games and television all the time. I suppose video games are a little better than television because they're a bit more active, But to me, that's it feels a bit wasteful. But I would say that the one important feature is, if you find anything you care about, that's better than doing things you absolutely don't care about. So so I don't think, I'm trying to think of other technology that is none of my kids have ever been that interested in video games, which is something, and I think so I'm probably not. I don't. I mean, in today's world, there are I don't know I don't think I have a good answer to that particularly. And oh boy. David asks, what might be the best investment opportunities over the next 20 years? I invest a lot in ideas. I don't invest a lot in companies and things like that. I've been lucky enough to make a decent amount of money in my life. I have not done anything very elaborate in terms of investing. I would say I have a couple of simple heuristics. One super simple heuristic is, if there's a company whose products I use and I like, then unless that company is sort of super overvalued because everybody else has discovered it too, I'll invest in that company. And I've done that a bunch of times, and that's led to some very successful investments. These are public companies where you just buy some shares type thing. That's one very simple heuristic I have, and these I'm going to be very clever, and I'm going to figure out that there's this lever in the world is going to move, and then that lever is going to move, and so on and so on and so on. I don't do that kind of investing. I know plenty of people who do. It is the one thing that I would say about that kind of investing is it's a lot of work. You have to actually pay attention, and you have to develop some intuition for how things really flow. And just because some company made a lot of noise and seems cool doesn't mean that it will actually be successful. Things like this, for me, the work necessary to do sort of elaborate investing is just not worth it to me. I would prefer to spend that time sort of inventing things, and maybe I'll make money from the things I invent. Maybe I won't. But I like spending the time inventing things, and actually probably purely financially, I come out ahead by spending the time sort of inventing new stuff rather than trying to sort of understand the levers in the world to deal with some existing, make some clever existing investment. I think that I've really never invested significantly in startups. I get solicited all the time for that. I sometimes invest time in startups by being an advisor to them. We quite often invest technology in startups from our company. I've sort of decided that for example, in my case, if I'm going to spend cash, I'm going to spend it on my own projects, not on somebody else's project, because I think that if I look at my own projects, I kind of know what's happening with them, and I kind of have control over what's going on. If it's somebody else's project, it's like, I've seen this so many times. It's like, I can see what they should do, and they go and do the exact opposite, and it fails. It's like, let me not also, be upset because I have my money in it. Let me only be like, look, I gave them the input and didn't take me very long. If they don't take it, well, so be it. So I haven't tended to do that. I think that in terms of kind of the trends in the world and how that relates to what one should invest in, that's very complicated, because there are a lot of trends where, yes, there are great things where the leading edge is intellectually very interesting, but no money is going to be made for a long time. And often the money gets made, sometimes there is a sort of sometimes I view it this way for myself, there's kind of a sliding scale between the things that are very intellectually interesting, And there are things that are very mundane and very mechanical, but they make a lot of money. And, in my life, I've kind of tried to run that slider somewhere in the middle where I get to do interesting things, but they also make enough money that I can go on and do other interesting things. There are cases where, look, one could do something more mundane, more turn the crank. I mean, the reason that turn the crank things tend to make money, more money, is because it's expensive to do new stuff. It's much easier to do same old kinds of things. You can make that much more efficient. The costs are much lower, and it's much more of a money machine than something where, we're making new stuff all the time. The making new stuff all the time is sort of a guaranteed it's going to cost a lot more money to do that. I think that, so I mean, this for myself, there's that sort of trade-off. Now, when it comes to investing in other people's things, sometimes the things that are really boring to you, they just turn the crank. Now, somebody might find it interesting because their interest is in sort of making the best possible operations for a company or some such other thing. Those might be the things that will in fact be the things that will make the most money. Now, I mean, there's another principle, I suppose, that things that are close to the money tend to make more money. So, in modern times, for better or worse, a lot of the kind of finance world is some of the most making the most money. But in a sense, that's because both the finance world and the world of sort of intermediaries, middle people between this and that, when you're close to a flow of money, it's much easier to make money than when you're off somewhere else, trying to sort of mine things out of the ground, so to speak, and you're not. It's a bad analogy, perhaps, but I mean, when you're sort of going and building a lot of frontline technologies that have never been built before, that's not a close to the money kind of activity. When you are sort of part of the flow from here to there, then of money, then that's much closer to the money. I think that that has been a way that people make money for themselves, not so much, I would say, well, in some cases also for investors. But so I don't have a great sort of comment about investing in things. I would say that the one heuristic that I have followed is, if I know about a company, and so sometimes I also will do it when I know the management of a company and I believe in them for one reason or another, and I think, I know them and I know that they're tenacious enough that even though their company is down, they're going to fight through, and it will not stay down. That's a good example of something. But I would say that, knowing a product, using a product yourself, you have to look a little bit at the company and make sure that it isn't something that for one reason or another is doomed for some reason you don't know, or is overvalued for some reason that isn't immediately obvious. But that's been a good heuristic for me. Let's see. RBS says, someone said, if you hear good reviews of your product from other people, then you've succeeded. If you don't hear any feedback from others, that's usually a bad sign. Yes and no. I mean, my observation is, look, in the products we make, I think people like them very much. And when I kind of go around the world and meet people and things, people are always saying, oh my gosh, I've used your products for 25 years and they're fantastic. And, or, I used Wolfram Alpha when I was in school, and, it saved me, or it convinced me to go into this or that field, or convinced me not to go into this or that field, whatever. But, so one gets very positive feedback when one happens to run into people. The thing that I've noticed is there are some kinds of feedback where you only get the feedback if it's negative. That is, for example, if you do language design, which is what I've spent a large part of my life doing, when people use the language you've designed and it just does what they expect, you never hear from them. They maybe long after the fact, they say, I've been using this for 20 years and it's wonderful and I really like it and the aesthetics are really, really work for me. But they won't they won't, it's very unlikely they'll send you a spontaneous piece of mail saying that. But if they find something which they find sort of abrasive, it's like, I'm trying to do this and it keeps on not working, that's when you hear from them. So it's, I think it's sort of it's true of a lot of kinds of user experience design, language design, and so on. You only hear from people when you get it wrong. When you get it right, the appreciation is indirect. It's lots of people use it and they do interesting things with it. And, maybe occasionally, if you happen to actually run into them, they'll say, hey, that was nice stuff. But otherwise, you don't really hear. That's been one experience. It's kind of like, one of the things I try to do in managing people at our company, there are some groups at the company where there might be cases where I would only ever talk to them if something has gone wrong. And I try and make a point of at least, having some level of interaction, even when it's like things are going fine. And, and so that it isn't the only time. I mean, like, for example, let's say computer systems people, where it's like, if the network is down, I'm going to be bugging them, or if something breaks, I'm going to be bugging them. It's always nice to have some level of sort of interaction with these people, so they're not only interacting with you when you're really upset because you can't work because the network is down or some such other thing. That's it's good to sometimes to try to provide feedback when it isn't, preemptively, when it isn't, when the only natural time for you to provide feedback is when it's negative. Let's see, Universe asks, you mentioned investing in ideas. What is your metric for investing in an individual with an idea? For example, are the winter and summer schools a place for you to find people to invest in? As I say, I'm not a big, invest as in his cash, go do something with it. I think that's not a particularly, there are many other people whose life is about taking cash and investing it and thinking through, does it really make sense to put $100,000 into this, $1 million into that, whatever else? That's a whole activity in its own right. And it's not something that I myself I don't think I'm utterly ignorant of what needs to be done, but it's not something that I'm taking a lot of time to do. And it does take time. And if you don't spend the time, you simply lose the money. So the investment I tend to do is much more of time, of kind of mentoring people, being advisors to companies, things like this. And I don't know, I think the heuristics there are, when it comes to companies that I advise, what are the heuristics? Do I think what they're doing is interesting? Will I learn something from hearing about it? Do I like the people? Do I find them people that I can talk to? The CEO typically is that. And then the third thing is, do I think they'll be successful? And I suppose another thing is, if I can come up with something really good, are they actually going to pay attention to that? Or do they have their own kind of definite view that might be disastrous, and they won't listen, whatever happens? I think that those are probably the criteria. And, it's a very difficult business, I have to say, because there's so many factors that go into the success of something like a company or whatever that people start. Just so many pieces. I mean, there are people where it's like, really, is this person going to succeed? How could they succeed? They're just, they're disorganized. They don't really understand things very well, but somehow they've just got the energy, the tenacity needed to succeed. And then there are other people who are like fully have their act together. They understand everything perfectly, but they just, something else goes wrong. They don't push quite hard enough. They get obsessed with some detail, and that detail turns out to not be what's important. All those kinds of things. It's very, very hard to predict. And I think that, I know I have friends who are sort of some leading venture capitalists of these times, And, I tend to hear from them. It's like, well, you kind of get a feeling, but you really don't know. And you just have to try it and see what happens, because it's really, really hard to know. And also from the outside, when you're dealing with a company, for example, there are things that are just super hard to know from the outside. Even when one has, I have a pretty large amount of experience now at these kinds of things, and I kind of am pretty decent at listening to kind of what people are really saying when they're describing companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even then, there are things you just can't tell. I mean, I would say when it comes to, okay, I will say one thing, which perhaps is in terms of investing even time, it's like I really want to understand what on earth is actually going on. What is this company making? What is the product? If it's all shrouded in mystery, then I tend to walk away, because I take the somewhat perhaps arrogant, confident point of view that I can understand anything, and if I really, really can't understand, it's a bad sign. So that's been another principle, which a lot of people don't take, by the way. And that leads to some horror stories of investments that people have of where they didn't kind of, where they just were like, oh, experts have said this and that and the other, so it must be true. And it's like, well, for me, that is not satisfying to me, and it's not convincing to me. It's like, I want to really understand this. It's kind of interesting. I tell one story related to that. I was the company with a sad history, Theranos. I happened to once, years ago now, be in Palo Alto, actually walking down the street with a woman who was the founder of a well-known biotech company, and we both knew that there was this particular pharmacy that was in the high street in Palo Alto or whatever, that was supposed to be a Theranos. You can get a blood test done with a Theranos, whatever. So we go. So I say, let's go in there. Let's go see what the actual story is. And it was interesting because there was some poor lab tech person there, and we're kind of asking these sort of general-ish questions about how does this work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was quite weak, and it was something where let's say based on that encounter, if I were a big time investor, not a chance. Now, if you hadn't actually done the sort of on the ground, now it would have been better if I'd been, talking to some, senior management person and really been able to ask serious questions, because some lab tech is just going to say, I don't know. We just send the thing to the lab type thing. I think people, the conceptual due diligence that people do on companies is often quite lacking. And it's kind of like, you got to actually understand what they're doing, or at least, if you believe you can trust yourself. If you just say, look, I'm going to invest in something, I don't really understand it. I understand that an expert said that it was a good thing. That's sort of a different story. Now, to be fair, with some venture capital investments, perhaps sadly, the story is not, is the company doing something that makes sense? The story is, can I flip my investment and make money? There are situations where it doesn't really matter if the thing works. It only matters that people believe it might work, or believe something about its future, promise. Because you're going to be, you invest X amount of money, somebody else is like going to buy the company, and you're going to make a big return on investment, independent of whether the thing ever worked. But again, that's not for me personally. I'm sort of more interested in the kind of drill down to the essentials and figure out things like, is it going to work, so to speak? So I mean, I suppose that's another criterion. Can I actually understand what somebody's trying to do, and does it make sense to me? And I've tried to keep track over my lifetime of things where I said, I think this is going to happen, and then it did, or I think this is going to happen, and then it took an extra 25 years, or I think this is going to happen, and then it didn't. And so I try to normalize myself by my past experiences to see, and I think it's really worthwhile to sort of keep track of that for oneself, and admit one's mistakes, so to speak, because it's very helpful to see, well, I was wrong about this. I thought this was going to work out great, or whatever, and then sometimes it's it's complicated because sometimes there's hype for things, and you kind of the hype is not justified, but sometimes there's a residue that actually does make sense. And sometimes there's no frigging residue at all. It's just nonsense. And eventually the world finds out, but it might take 5 to 10 years for the world to find out. And by the way, in terms of pure investment kinds of things, it might be just fine for the hype to be running for those 5 or 10 years. And, you were in it for 3 years and you did great from your investment. Not the way I tend to do things, but it's, if your goal is pure investment, it can be a worthwhile approach. Okay, John is asking, is the technological innovation you're anticipating, hoping coming in the next few years? Look, I mean, I myself have developed a bunch of technology ideas, whatever, that it's kind of a little bit disappointing because I know they're coming. I mean, in the sense I built them, but they're right now artifacts from the future. They're things, a lot of what's in Wolfram language is kind of an artifact from 50 to 100 years in the future. Fortunately, people can use it today. Many people do, but not nearly as many as will eventually use those ideas. And it's kind of a slightly frustrating thing to see that one is in this situation where there are inexorable kind of forces that will lead to, for example, the computationalization of everything. The idea of kind of computational language as a way to express oneself and to express things, whether they're contracts or whether they're preferences or whatever else. The sort of computational language as the new form of literacy. All this stuff, and that's kind of the technology stack I've been building for the last 40 years. And it's a very unique technology stack at this point. We built this kind of very tall tower, and there are really no other buildings of substantial height anywhere nearby. There, many people have done many, many other things, but this particular tower of kind of computational language and so on is a unique tower that we've built. And we can see people having dramatic, wonderful careers that get built because they are, they climbed this tower, so to speak. And that's always very, very satisfying to see. But they're also, in terms of sort of what everybody says, oh, yeah, we understand how all this works. They're really at just the very low floors of that tower. It's a small number of people who've sort of climbed to the top, to great advantage to them. But, eventually, 50 to 100 years from now, it's kind of like everybody will say, oh, yeah, we all know what it looks like from the top, so to speak. But that's a long time from now. And, it is something where I must admit that I'm a little bit, it's a challenging thing when you can see that that's sort of an inexorable endpoint, and you even have the technology today, but the sort of ambient level of understanding advances very slowly. And so, that's a challenge for, you build the technology. Fortunately, we have lots of people who do understand it and who buy it, and, we make a living from that. But there are many more who could understand it. And it's a great, the question is how you economically make it be the case that you've kind of communicated that to the world and so on. And it's kind of a thing where sort of for the good of the world, many more people should understand this stuff, but it's not clear how you make that work from sort of, what the effort and reward curves look like in terms of communicating things sort of ahead of their time like that. But, the thing that I've tended to notice is there are sort of technology directions that are sort of inevitable, and there are other ones where it's a surprise. And there are ones where it's a surprise, but after it happened, you could say, oh, of course it was going to happen that way. I would say that they're an example of something. There are always drivers of sort of rethinking existing ideas. So, for example, the iPhone, smartphones. We've had user interfaces on computers, but it all gets rethought when you have a touch interface and you have a thing that you hold in your hand. You could say it's not really fundamentally different, but it is different enough that you rethink things, between sort of desktop applications and apps, and you can have the camera in there all the time, and whereas your computer, that's you're not usually sort of turning your computer around to take a picture of things. So it feels at first like it's just a matter of details, that, it's on a smartphone rather than on a computer. But it turns out it makes you rethink a bunch of things. And you see that happening in a bunch of places. Blockchain is another big place where, I don't know, the fundamental importance of the kind of, the single, distributed ledger type thing of blockchain. I'm not sure that's the most important thing. The really important thing is that concept has been a driver for rethinking a lot of kind of transaction processing and governance kinds of ideas in the world. And it's kind of like some of those things, it's like 40, 50 years since those were last really sort of revised. And it's like now you look at them with modern eyes and there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think one of the things that you see is this sort of drivers based on sort of new modalities of doing things. The cloud was another example of it really wasn't new. Time-shared computers, they existed long, long ago. But then, when it came through, as it was a rethinking of lots of things, which at first seemed like a thing of details, but really it's just a kind of, okay, take this thing we were doing and just, turn it over again, rethink it. And then there are opportunities there. I think, the same thing will happen with other interface modalities. When augmented reality becomes a real thing, finally, there'll be a bunch of rethinking that is useful there. There'll be a bunch of new things that become possible. There'll be a bunch of things that existed that start to be able to be done. I mean, I would say, I think I've said this many times, that the usual pattern is methodological advance happens, 5 or 10 years of low-hanging fruit to be picked. I would say that sometimes for big enough methodological advances, those 5 or 10 years end up being much longer. And for example, for the general idea of computation, the sort of computational paradigm, computational language, all these kinds of things, that timescale is much longer. There are individual sub-pieces where the timescale will be 5 or 10 years, but the bigger picture is more like in the century time frame in that case. But I think, and we see other kinds of things, at any given moment, like machine learning had its sort of big coming out around 2011, 2012. It's kind of, it had this big peak. I would tend to think that it's in the kind of becoming just a standard methodology type stage now, rather than being the sort of high value, low-hanging fruit to be picked. It's not in the sort of high slope part of the curve, I think, at this point. And there are all sorts of different things like that. But I think what you have to look for is these things where it's a new sort of platform that comes in, that becomes possible, a new methodology. I'm sure there'll be things where, when you can send things into orbit really cheaply, which you're beginning to be able to do, there'll suddenly be a bunch of things you can now do, and which one hadn't thought of. And I think those are, I don't know whether 5G will be a driver for sort of new stuff. I don't know how much of, people, there's a lot of fake 5G, so to speak. But when truly low latency, higher bandwidth kinds of communications become possible, if that happens in a sort of defined period, maybe there are things which suddenly now become possible that weren't before. And there'll be another one of these sort of bursts of really taking things that already existed and you redo them. Now, there are things, there's another trend everybody knows, sort of the disintermediation trend, or the automation of intermediation, the Uber type trend of there was a thing, but it was done with rather old systems, and it was done in a way that was, had some sort of old entrenched sort of mechanism there. And we can now use automation software, basically, to sort of get rid of some parts of what was needed to be done in that sort of intermediate layer. And so then we can create something new and different. And for example, I've been looking a bit at disintermediation of universities. I don't know whether that's going to happen. I don't know whether that, how that really works. But for example, the graduate school level, it's not completely clear how that, how the sort of intermediate layer of, you've got the graduate advisor, you've got the student, they sort of want to get paired up, but it's not clear how the intermediation of the university is that significant there. I mean, I'm not sure how that will work out, but that's an example of something where one can imagine things could change, but hard to really see that until it's come. But there are a lot of other areas. There are other kinds of trends one sees. I would say that somehow, the computationalization, the automation of everything, that's a really long-term trend, and that's something that we can expect will only continue. But each different stage of automation is defined by specific methodological advances. If I look at other areas, I mean, there are things that I've been sort of carrying around as pet things that I'm sure are going to happen one day. One is molecular scale computing. I mean, I actually realized some things about this even very recently. A lot of things that come out of our physics project suggest approaches to molecular computing that are a bit different than what they have been before. The big clue that we have about molecular computing is us, our biological character, because we are essentially molecular scale computers. And the thing that I've sort of realized a little bit is that I kind of imagined that we were just sort of this mushy stuff that was kind of a liquid where all these molecules were bouncing around and interacting, and that's what led to all of these biological processes. I think it's becoming increasingly clear from just the actual progress of biology that things are more orchestrated than we thought. There are little, fibers that things go down. There are specific, enzymes that lock into this and make that, and so on. And I've kind of, come to think that the way biology is set up, it looks at and feels a lot more like engineering than I had imagined previously. Now some of that, it's not to say that it's making use of. It's not that it's any more designed, but it's doing things that are much more precise than one might have thought. And I kind of had the following realization that electronics is the story of, you take blocks of silicon and you basically etch out pieces to correspond to wires and transistors and things like that. And essentially the working fluid of a computer is electrons. And, it's moving those around and so on, just like, the working fluid of a steam engine is steam and water and so on. But what I realized is that in molecular computing, sort of the working fluid is molecules of different kinds, sometimes just protons, sometimes just electrons, but often molecules of different kinds. And actually, it could very well be the case that just like we see in biology, with sort of wires all the way down. It's kind of very organized, kind of spatially organized kinds of things in many places. And not always, but many places. And so sort of the realization that I had is that a very recent realization that if we look at nanotechnology and molecular computing and so on, that it's quite possible that the big thing will be kind of this almost fluidic collection of wires where you have just sort of a different working fluid than electrons, which we have in computers. And then that's sort of the way that things, that's the thing one should be aiming for, is the kind of the nanotechnology thing that is this, perhaps it's just etched out of some material, just like it is for semiconductors. And it's literally sort of the physical wiring of connecting this to that through tubes effectively. And then arranging for certain kinds of chemical interactions that happen there. Now, I think the one thing that is a notable feature is in a typical computer today, the computer that I have in front of me right now, most of its billions of transistors aren't doing anything right now. Computers, most of the time, many parts of them are quite, it's just a particular pathway that's used to do the things we want our computer to do most of the time. In biology, my guess is that a lot more is being used. It's not the case that, this collection of molecules just aren't doing anything right now. There's much more sort of parallel stuff happening. And I think that question of sort of how we architect this very parallel kind of computation that's happening in biology or that we can imagine happening in nanotechnology is highly interesting. And I'm sort of very much on the path right now of understanding how these multi-computation ideas from our physics project will relate to the practicalities of doing that kind of parallel and distributed computing. It's really a weird case because, I really thought this physics project wouldn't have any applications for at least 200 years. And I've been very surprised that it's having, kind of the ideas from it have such near-term applications. But so that's an example. My failure to predict technology advancements, because I didn't see that this basic science advance was going to lead to what I think will be some fairly near-term technology advances, in much less than 200 years, so to speak. Another thing about technology and technology prediction is, sometimes it's a lot easier to figure out what will happen than when it will happen. It's also sometimes you think that something very fancy and, we can just about manage that is going to be what's important. But the thing that's really important is something that is a very mundane aspect of what's possible, given the big stretch that you made. So, computers are a great example. You do all these things, you figure out how you do arbitrary computations, and then what do they get used for when they're personal computers? They get used for word processing, which is something that didn't really use all of that, we're an amazing universal computer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's something we could have built, and some people did build special purpose word processors, but it's something that one could have built sort of without going through that whole level of sort of computer sophistication, so to speak. And that's a thing. Sometimes it's very easy to miss that because you're looking at the big thing that was achieved. Oh my gosh, we just managed to figure out how to, send things cheaply into orbit. Well, actually, the thing you missed was the real thing that's important is, being able to launch little cargo planes that go, I don't know what, some such thing like that, where you were doing the hard thing, but actually there was an easy thing that you finally figured out how to make possible by doing the hard thing, but it's the easy thing that ends up being more important for the world, at least in the short term. So that's another place where at least I've seen sort of technology prediction tend to fail. Now, if you ask me, how far out can I predict certain kinds of things? There's some things which are just on a track, and you can just see it's going to go chunk, chunk, chunk. I mean, all the stuff with computational language, it's on a track. It is inexorably going to be progressively more important. People are progressively going to formulate more and more things in terms of it. I can't tell you how long it's going to take. Currently I'm, we got to speed it up because I want to be around to see what happens. But it's, I think, it's looking like a long time right now. And it's looking like, which is another way of saying, if you're in it now, then you have sort of the 50-year advantage over other people because everybody's going to know about it in 50 years. But it's only a smaller fraction of people who know about it now. Let's see. Well, there's a question here from Wabu asking, what was it like handling the business side of things, being a creator? Was it something you liked or did out of necessity? Was it hard or easy? Did you do it all yourself, to hire somebody, etc.? Okay, well, so I've been at this a long time. So I started my first company when I was 21 years old, I guess. And I had been sort of a fast rising sort of academic professory type. And I built a bunch of technology that I built because I wanted it. And I built it in a pretty organized way. My first big computer system called SMP, the Symbolic Manipulation Program. And this is a slightly complicated story. I think I've told it other times here about kind of the complicated interactions with the university I was at the time, Caltech, about this. But the end result was I kind of realized I got to start a company that does things with the software I've created. So, my plan A, 21 years old, I've just, young faculty member at Caltech, and it's, you know, in mostly in physics, and it's like, what do I know about running businesses? And so I thought, well, gosh, you know, the only choice I have is to sort of hire somebody to run the business, and, you know, I'll do the technology and they'll run the business. And I found a pretty good person, about twice my age, and you know, he was, you know, had a pretty good background and such like, and he brought in other people, and sort of the thing got started. I was kind of very, you know, nonplussed when we were like raising money and things, which we did, kind of got investors, and I basically got at least half of our initial investment. So I was a little bit, yeah, you know, I thought I was not doing that stuff. I thought you guys were doing that stuff. And then, you know, the company starts operating, and I kept on kind of like, look, I think the common sense thing to do is X. And it's like, no, we'll do the exact opposite of X. And I kept on being right, and they kept on being wrong. So that was it was educational for me to see that. You know, in the end, I'm like, I'm out of here. This is crazy. The company eventually went public in a rather undistinguished IPO, but that's a different story. But you know, so my initial experience was, I didn't think I knew anything about like running companies and such like, but turns out I had better common sense than I thought. And I think the number one issue is, are you actually able to apply whatever thinking capabilities you have to lots of different things? Or do you just narrowly define them and apply them to one particular kind of thing? And I suppose one of the things that I've managed to do, or I'm able to do for whatever reason, is it's like, look, you know, I can think about all kinds of different things. I'm not just thinking about sort of, you know, techie, you know, kinds of things. I can sort of apply thinking to lots of kinds of things, and you can apply, you know, it turns out you can apply many of the same kinds of analytical thinking techniques to problems about strategy of companies as you can to problems about, you know, math or physics or whatever else. You have to be sort of practical about the world. You have to not think, I suppose you have to develop intuition. And maybe I was fortunate in that I suppose in doing science, a lot of what I managed to do is develop reasonable intuition for this is how things are going to work. And, you know, and that's very helpful in science. It's also very helpful in understanding things in the world and in business. It's like, get an intuition. You know, is this deal that I'm presented with here, does it actually make any sense? Or is it just a crazy idea? You know, those are things where the better you get at being able to answer that, the easier of a time you're going to have. Now, I suppose for me personally, as I started businesses and things, you know, I find people interesting. So that probably is helpful because, you know, I suppose I'm sufficiently aware of people that, you know, present me various people, and I have at least a fighting chance of being able to figure out what kinds of things they'll be able to do or not do. And I would say when I first started my first company, I made some mistakes in that regard of people where some people where I'm pretty sure this person really isn't going to be able to do this. Okay, fine. Or, you know, this person, they sound like they can do this, and it turns out they're not so great at doing it. But, you know, by the time I started my current company in 1986, you know, I had actually spent a number of years. I'd mostly been an academic kind of basic research person, but I had also had sort of a hobby doing strategy consulting for technology companies. And that was very useful because I saw all kinds of things then. And, you know, when I came to start my current company, I pretty much, you know, I sort of thought I knew more or less what I was doing. I didn't, you know, I wish I'd had kind of true sort of partners and things. I didn't. I mean, it was really kind of me. And, you know, I had lots of people who worked with me, but I didn't like have, you know, my business partner XYZ, so to speak. It's something where, you know, I'm all these years I look for people who can serve in those kinds of roles because I'm not that, you know, it's not what I'm that interested in. I think I'm able to apply what I view as common sense. Some other people, you know, I would say particularly when I advise other companies, my normalization for things is often, have they already figured out the things that I tell them? And the answer is usually not. So it's somehow this, apply thinking to kind of business and strategy and so on. Turns out that's not a thing that is in as ready supply as I had assumed it was, because I didn't think I had anything special going on in terms of being able to figure out those sorts of things. But I have to say, I think in the end, sort of insofar as I've been able to be successful at those kinds of things, part of it is, again, the drill down to what the point is. Don't sort of just say, oh, experts say X, Y, Z. It's like, let me understand this for myself. Let me understand what is the strategy. How do you get from here to there? It's like, well, we have this strategy and then there's a big kind of fuzzy piece in the middle. Well, the fuzzy piece in the middle is the part that's going to fail. You've got to figure out how do you actually draw lines through that piece and see how it's really going to work. And how do you go step by step? We're making this product. We're going to build it this way. We're going to distribute it this way. We're going to tell people about it this way. Are those steps plausible? And can you make them plausible? And I think so. I think those are the kinds of things. My experience with sort of hiring people to take your creative ideas and do wonderful things with them, my personal experience with that has not been very good. Now, possibly that's because I am maybe more competent than I expect at doing the kind of the business strategy management type stuff. I'm not sure. I think that I often think, were I less competent at that, I might have had led a simpler life, because I would have had to bring in other people to do that stuff. And I wouldn't have even been able to try doing it myself. But, I think the thing to realize is, if you created something and you really understand it and you have the vision for it, you have a huge advantage over everybody else. And, if you bring somebody in and say, hey, take this vision that I have and, run all the pieces of it, that's, sort of extend that vision in some way, it's a challenging thing. And people will tend to, well, I have a little bit of a different vision. And then you say, but I don't like your other vision. I want to go for my vision. Or alternatively, they say, well, I don't really get your vision. But, or they cut, there's a lot of things. If you understand what the point is, then you have a big advantage in defining strategy. And I think, I have known some people who've been very fortunate to end up with kind of business partners who sort of are, who enjoy I would say that this happened to me to some extent too. There are people who sort of enjoy the creative things that I'm doing or that we're doing, but aren't into actually doing those things themselves. But their real kind of pride and interest is in running the operations of something and, making it commercial and things like that. And that's a very great sort of complementary situation. But it always goes wrong when the people are like, well, I have a vision too, that tends to not end well. All right, I should go soon here. Well, Lionel asks, what are the techniques for developing intuition, particularly when working with abstract concepts in math and physics and business? Look, I think the more you know, the more you do, the better your intuition is going to be. I think that intuition is a lot sort of extrapolating from experience. In some sense, the kinds of things we see in machine learning systems are a very much more concrete version of what I think goes on in a lot of our kind of intuition. Of like, we've seen a lot of things like that before. This thing we see now fits into that pattern. So now let's see how that works. Now, I would say that, let me give you an example of an intuition building thing. So, we have at our company a big computer system. It's complicated, and we have lots of products which are very complicated, hundreds of millions of lines of code and things like this. And sometimes things go wrong. Okay. And people will say, oh, there's some horrible bug, some horrible thing goes down, this or that or the other. And it's like, I always ask when it was, people say, oh, we solved it, it's all good. And I always say, what went wrong? What was the bug? What was the problem? Why do I ask that? Because I'm basically building my experience base, my intuition base for, oh, wow, that's the thing that could go wrong. I never thought of that. But now another few years go by and something happens. Like there was just one, what was it, this morning? There was a thing where, oh my gosh, I've forgotten it already. But there was a thing where people were explaining, I remember what it was. It was about some reporting mechanism. And people were saying, oh, it takes a whole person to run these manual reports and so on. I'm like, this has to be wrong. This can't be that way. And it's like, how could that be? Well, we didn't have an answer right then, but we'll get an answer. And eventually, the next time I hear, oh, it's so difficult to run these things, I'll kind of remember back to this case where it's like, well, that was this problem, and so on. So I think that's an important thing. And I think you often find kind of a lot of sort of intuition in my experience is, it's matching patterns of things you've seen before and being able to take something that was in one framework and transport it to another framework. I mean, certainly in science, a lot of the things some of the really spectacular things that have come out of our physics project have to do with kind of transporting the formalism of physics to distributed computing, or the formalism of metamathematics to physics, or whatever else. These are kind of things where you've kind of got a pattern of thinking in one of these areas, and now you transport it to another area. And it's a very fertile thing to do because it's had a certain amount of development in the first area, and now you get to just sort of a free ride in the area that you're transporting it to. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with a lot of kind of these leaps of intuition that one might do. Here's another thing. When I hear about something and somebody's telling me about there's this and this and this and this, and it's like, okay, I'm thinking to myself, where have I heard something like that before? And that's what I'm really trying to do. I'm trying to fit it into this pattern of things that I've understood before. And it's like, and then like, oh my gosh, it's just this. Now, you can be trapped by that way of thinking. And I've seen people do that, for example, with things I've discovered or invented where I know it's new. And I know that there is no intuition, that it's just something very different from what one's seen before. And probably my most extreme case of that was all the work about sort of simple programs in the computational universe that led to this big book of mine from 20 years ago called A New Kind of Science. And part of the reason I gave the book that name is because it was describing what was in there. It is a new kind of science. And as soon as somebody comes to it and says, hey, wait a minute, I can fit it into this pattern, I can fit it into that pattern, it will fail and they will be confused. And I watched many people fall into that trap, because actually what one had found there was something actually new that wasn't something that fit into some existing framework. I had, by the time I put out that book, I had spent like 15 years kind of trawling the world for, what is this related to? How does this relate to what we've seen before? And there were many signs, but there wasn't the big ideas there. They weren't there. They didn't exist. And so it was important to communicate that's something new. And occasionally, when you say, let me take what I'm now learning and fit it into something I knew before, that doesn't always work because there are new things in the world. It usually works. It works more often than not. And sometimes another piece of sort of meta intuition is when somebody's telling you about something, one of the things that actually sometimes I'll even just outright ask, is the thing you're telling me a big deal or not? Right? Are you telling me something where I should be able to just incrementally fit it into something I already know? Or are you telling me something that's really a big new fact that's very surprising and that I'm not going to be able to fit in? Because even just knowing this is a big new surprising thing, the way I think about it is going to be different than if I'm like, this is an incremental thing, or this could actually be something that's just the same as this thing over here. So, that sort of meta intuition of, is the thing that I'm being told big or is it incremental, is another thing that's fairly important to develop. I think, when it comes to things like business, one of the things there is I don't know. There's a certain, you have to have a certain degree of sort of optimism, or you just sort of give up and don't do anything. But you also have to have a certain, things that are too good to be true are too good to be true, so to speak. It's very, very rare that there's something that's like, oh, there's this amazing thing that's going to be easy and it's going to be incredibly commercially successful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's almost, doesn't happen. You have to put real work in. It's going to turn out, yes, somebody says, oh, it's going to be fantastic, but actually there's this very Faustian tail to the whole thing, or whatever else. And, I think that's a piece of sort of business intuition. Is this plausible? I mean, it's like people will tell me about some logistical thing. Oh, yeah, you'll get there and it'll all be fine and this and that and the other. And it's like, look, I know enough about the world. This is not going to be trivial. This is something where, again, sometimes it's like, well, why? Why did that? If you keep on asking why, then, like, okay, somebody says, oh, this in some business setting, oh, these people are going to be thrilled to do blah, 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 blah. Okay, why? Why does that make sense? Why does it make sense for them? Is that part of their business? Is it something that they find interesting? Is it this? Is it that? Why? If there's no answer to that, it's like, well, somebody can tell you it's going to be great, et cetera. But I don't understand why. I haven't managed to join the dots to actually be able to get it to something that makes sense to me. It's just, I'm just listening to somebody telling me promoting something to me. And I would say that that's in terms of business, that is really being able to see through these steps is a really important thing. And in terms of the sort of developing intuition, knowing what all those steps are. So for example, in science, what I found is whenever there's a fuzzy and then there's a miracle that happens and then you get to the other side, those are the parts that are always kind of the soft parts that don't work out very well. And so what I've tried to, I try to make sure I do understand all those steps. And by the way, this is where the whole computational language story is really important, because when you express something in a computational language, it is a very definite expression of those ideas. It's an expression of those ideas that your computer can understand as well as you. And that's something that it's a way of sort of really defining, clarifying those ideas. And that's something you get to do in science. I think that sort of understanding ideas all the way through is important. Same in business. When people kind of tell you, I don't know, you're managing some project or you're trying to make some deal, whatever else, and there's a big fuzzy bit in the middle where you don't really know how it works or you don't really know why it should work, that's the place where things are going to fail. Now, probably there's some chance that it won't fail. There's some chance that fuzzy bit will work out, really hunky-dory. But for me, at least, I tend to not assume that. And insofar as one sort of develops intuition about things, I think the way that it's much easier to have intuitions if you can see all the steps. To have intuition about whether this fuzzy bit is going to work out when it's kind of mysterious and hidden inside is much more challenging. All right, I think I should need to wrap up here, but thank you for a bunch of interesting questions. And I see there are a bunch of others I didn't get to here, and look forward to doing this again another time. So thanks very much, and bye for now.